All right, well, it's 1:30. Go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 9th Annual On the Sea Science Festival. My name is Catherine Hagman. I'll be your host for this session. So excited to have you all joining us today. We're also joined by CIGLR and Peter Alsip. We're going to learn all about invasive Asian carps. So welcome, Peter.
Thank you. Can you guys hear me all right? Okay, one second. I need to share sound. Okay. All right, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for the introduction, Catherine. As Catherine mentioned, my name is Peter Alsip, and I'm a staff member at the University of Michigan's Cooperative Institute for Great Lakes Research, where I get to study a lot of cool different aspects of the Great Lakes ecosystem, including the topic that I'm going to be talking to you guys today about, which is understanding the risk of invasive Asian carp in the Great Lakes. Now, this is something I've had the privilege of studying for the past 3 years of my career. And I'm really excited to talk to you guys today about it because I think these fish are really cool and really interesting, but also very worrisome for what they could mean to the Great Lakes. And so today I'm really going to try to introduce you to each of these species and try to convey why we're concerned about a potential invasion into the Great Lakes. So the term Asian carp is actually kind of confusing because it doesn't refer to just one fish, but rather it refers to 4 distinct species. In fact, we sometimes refer to them as the 4 major Chinese carps because these were the 4 carps grown for food purposes for thousands of years in China in a process called aquaculture. And they are the bighead carp, the silver carp, the grass carp, and the black carp. Now, all these species have important distinctions that I'll go over today, and it implies different things for the ecosystems they're in, but they do share some general characteristics that make them particularly harmful to ecosystems they invade. First, they all grow very quickly to large sizes, which means there's few predators, especially in the Great Lakes, that will be able to eat an adult Asian carp. Secondly, they're all highly reproductive fishes. An individual female of any of these species can produce upwards of 1 million eggs in 1 year. So if there's enough resources to support a population, you could see a dense population really establish. And then finally, they're all voracious feeders, which means they're putting a lot of stress on the ecosystem and competing with other species in the ecosystem. And this gives them a high potential to disrupt the balance of the entire ecosystem. So if there's one thing you're going to remember from this talk, it's that when you hear the term Asian carp, you should always ask, what species are we talking about? Because the species are very distinct in how they feed and how they will affect the ecosystem, and so their invasion risk will also differ. So all of these species are found natively in East Asia. Their native range extends from China's southern border to its northern border with Russia, which is a pretty broad latitudinal range. And if you transposed it over North America, it would be comparable to a range stretching from northern Mexico to the center of Canada. And all of these fish were brought over intentionally by the United States federal government in the 1960s as means of controlling other problems that we thought these fish were well suited to do. The bighead and silver carp, pictured in the top right here, were brought over to control algae growth in sewage treatment lagoons. Sewage carries a lot of nutrients and can spur algae blooms, as we just learned about in Holly's talk. And these fish are pretty adept at consuming that algae and can keep those blooms down. The black carp were brought in to control snails that can harbor parasites inhabiting catfish ponds. And if you're raising catfish to sell at the grocery store, you want to make sure they're not infected with parasites. One way to do that is to remove that intermediate host that the snails are, and the black carp are well suited to do that. And then finally, the grass carp were brought in because they consume aquatic plants on the bottom of rivers and lakes. And so they're used often to control nuisance weeds and aquatic weeds in ponds and reservoirs. Now, while all these species were brought over from the same region of East Asia, with good intentions, they are now all considered invasive because of their harmful ecological and economic impacts. And so what I want to do today is really go over what our primary concerns are with each of these species and kind of delineate how they're different from each other. So the first species I'll talk about is the black carp. Now the black carp of all the 4 Asian carp species can grow to be the largest. They can reach sizes up to 5 feet in length and 150 pounds in weight. However, we typically only find them to be around 3 feet and 33 pounds in North America, which is still pretty large by freshwater fish standard, especially in North America. And black carp, what makes them unique relative to the other Asian carp species is that they're able to consume mussels and snails. They're molluscivores, so they're going to eat mollusks like the mussels, snails, and clams. And the way they're able to do this is because they have a unique chewing apparatus that's situated in their back of their throat, which is shown in a 3D representation down here in the bottom left. And this is called their pharyngeal teeth and their crushing pad. And so what a black carp will do when it's feeding is it will suck up a clam, send it to its back of its throat, crush the shell, and then spit it all out and pick through the bits to consume the flesh of the animal. Now, the reason we're concerned is because these guys can eat a lot of clams and mussels. In fact, an adult black carp can eat about 4 pounds of mussels a day. And so we're worried that if they were to get into the Great Lakes, they could put stress on our already struggling native mussel populations. Our native mussel populations in the Great Lakes have been struggling primarily due to the invasion of two non-native mussels, the zebra and quagga mussels, which I'm sure if you follow Great Lakes ecology, you'll hear a lot about those mussels. And one of their effects is that they've literally smothered out a lot of our natives. And so with the introduction of black carp, we're worried that they could cause a regional extinction of these last remaining native mussels. Now, black carp are also the most restricted in terms of their distribution in the United States, and they're the furthest currently from the Great Lakes. And that's shown in this map here on the top right. This red area shows their current distribution in the United States. And they're mostly in the middle Mississippi River down here. However, they are starting to encroach up the Illinois River, which does connect to Lake Michigan, and that's a possible port of entry for these species into the lakes. Now, this is a video that was sent to me by colleagues at the USGS or US Geological Survey in Columbia, Missouri, who work with these fish more hands-on than I do. And it just kind of shows how these fish eat. So this video on the left will show how they can just suck up mussels or clams. And then this video on the right is going to show the fish regurgitating a clam that it's already consumed, and then it will suck it back up. And if you listen closely, it might be hard to hear. You'll hear a crunch sound, which is the fish smashing the mussel again in its crushing plate. It's going to spit it up. But if you listen closely, it's a little snap. It's subtle, but that's the crush of the mussel's shell. Okay, so the next species I'll talk about are the grass carp. And just like the other Asian carp species, these animals can grow to be quite large, reaching sizes upwards of 80 pounds. And as I mentioned before, they're called grass carp because they eat, you could think of it like grass. They're like little sea cows. They eat a lot of the aquatic plants that grow on the bottom of rivers, lakes, and reservoirs. And because of that, the concern we have about them is really about what they could do to our wetlands in the Great Lakes, which are habitats that contain that are comprised of a lot of these aquatic plants. And there's a lot of species in the Great Lakes that depend on these habitats for spawning in nurseries, as well as for feeding grounds, such as fish like the northern pike, shown in the bottom right here, which is a popular sport fish in our region, as well as waterfowl might be affected by this too, because waterfowl like the ringneck duck shown here also use wetlands as important feeding grounds and nesting habitat. And so grass carp really have the potential to have a very broad impact because of what they consume as habitat for other species. They might not just be affecting fish, but they could affect waterfowl and other wildlife as well. Now, you'll also notice that grass carp are the most extensively distributed species of the Asian carp in the United States. And the reason for that is because grass carp were, and in some states still are, intentionally stocked to control aquatic plants and annoying weeds. And however, most states that allow stocking still require that the fish be sterilized, which means they can't reproduce. So if they were to get out into the wild, they couldn't create an invasive population. However, sterilization isn't 100% effective. So every so often you might get a once sterilized fish become fertile again. And if that fish was to escape into a natural waterway, they could contribute to an invasive population, which has happened in parts of the country. So there's actually been some infrequent occurrences of grass carp in Lake Erie in the since the 1980s, and that's shown in this plot on the top right. It's a map of Lake Erie, and each orange dot here is showing detected a grass carp occurrence between 1979 and 2010. Now, at the time, scientists and managers weren't too concerned because we believe these to be the sterilized individuals, so they wouldn't be invasive. However, this changed in 2012 when managers found a juvenile grass carp in the Sandusky River, which is right around here and drains into Lake Erie. And the presence of a juvenile indicates there could be a reproducing population. So we've really, scientists and managers have increased the amount of monitoring efforts that have gone on in the past 10 years. And what we've seen is an increase in the number of grass carp detections. And that's shown in this bottom map showing the past decade of detections with each orange dot, again, representing a grass carp. Now, not only have we seen an increased occurrence of them, but we now also have evidence that grass carp are reproducing in some of these tributaries to Lake Erie, which would make them the only Asian carp species to be have an actively reproducing population in the Great Lakes, meaning the invasion is currently underway. Now, right now, there's large coordinated efforts among states and federal agencies to track, contain, and remove the grass carp populations in Western Lake Erie. The goal right now is to limit the spread and to limit the population to hopefully limit any impacts from these species. Now, the final two species I'm going to cover together because they are very similar in their ecology, and that's the silver carp and bighead carp pictured here. Silver carp and bighead carp are what we call planktivores, which means they eat plankton, which is the small microscopic animals, which are referred to as zooplankton, or the microscopic floating plants known as algae and phytoplankton, which float around in the water column. Now, these fish can eat a lot of plankton, and because of that, we're worried about that they will outcompete our resident or native plankton eating fishes, some of which are important prey fish, such as alewife, gizzard shad, emerald shiner, and rainbow smelt, to name a few. And like I said, these are important prey fish. So that means the fish that we like to catch and eat, like trout, salmon, and walleye, are going to be eating these smaller fish. And so if bighead and silver carp were to get into the lakes and outcompete these smaller fish, they would also potentially have effects on these big fish-eating fish that, again, are the more charismatic fish that we go fishing for. And so they could really disrupt the food web because they feed at the bottom of it on the plankton. Now, I'm going to show a video here, and I'm going to warn, I think I have the sound off, but if the sound is not off, it might be loud. And it's a video that I'm sure some people who have Googled or you searched in YouTube Asian carp, you'll see videos like this. And what it is showing is scientists doing a surveying method called electrofishing, which is a common way to know what kind of fish exist in an ecosystem. And it's also used here to stun and collect and then remove carp from this waterway below a dam in Kentucky. So you'll see these long yellow rods are sticking into the water. They're gonna essentially hold nodes that hang into the water and generate an electric current that will attract the fish and then stun them so they could be removed. And you'll see the fish, as soon as the generator turns on, start jumping, and that's these are all silver carp. They're notorious for their jumping behavior. So here they kick it on, and you can see this also is a good way to visualize just how dense these populations can get in certain waterways that have enough food to support them. And so you can see then around the boat, a lot of these fish are stunned and now can be removed. Okay, for the sake of time, I'll keep moving. So bighead carp and silver carp are more moderately distributed of the 4 Asian carp species, as in they're not as extensively found as the grass carp, but they're not as restricted as the black carp. And that's seen in this map on the top left, where you can see they're in much of the Midwest and most of this stretch of the Illinois River, which is currently where their adult population front is. Now, the Illinois River is connected to Lake Michigan through a series of man-made canals called the Chicago Area Waterway System, which is shown here. And that is the main threat we're concerned about with of how these fish might enter the lake. Currently, the invasion front, or where the most adult population is, most of the adult population is about 47 miles away from Lake Michigan. And that's shown in this green stretch of river here, referred to as the Dresden Island Pool. Now, The main line of defense that will prevent further movement up the waterway is this electric barrier system in Romeoville, Illinois, which is near Joliet, Illinois. And what this does is it generates an electrical field that deters movement of most fish through it. And it's a pretty effective tool at preventing interbasin transfer of aquatic species, not just Asian carp. So it's meant to protect both the Mississippi River Basin as well as the Great Lakes ecosystem. Okay, so there's also plans, to install another barrier at this Brandon Road lock and dam, so right around here. And that would just be an additional line of defense, and it will also use an array of different technologies to prevent further movement. So I just wanted to share another video from the USGS that shows just how quickly these fish can filter through water. So here, USGS scientists are injecting algae into the water, and you'll see all these juvenile silver carp come quickly to filter it. So here are all the silver carp. You'll see that they remove that cloud of algae in roughly 10 to 15 seconds. It just shows how impressive their filtering capacity is. And then if you wanted to see what an adult silver carp or bighead carp look like when they feed, this video is also from the USGS. You'll see they're opening and closing their mouths in a process that's called pump feeding. And when they open their mouths, they're creating a negative pressure that will bring water in that not only rushes over their gills and oxygenates their blood, but also brings any food in that water through this filtering apparatus that's shown on the right here called gill rakers. Now, in bighead carp down here, they kind of look like fleshy combs. In silver carp, they look more like a sponge. And again, this just captures any food that's in that water, filters it out, and passes it along to the fish's digestive tract. So finally, you've now learned about these 4, what I think are really cool, but also potentially very worrisome fishes. And I know there's a lot of information to remember. So if there's only one thing you remember from this talk, it's always to ask, which species, whenever you hear the term Asian carp used in a news story or elsewhere, because as we've just learned, they all have a potential for disrupting the Great Lake ecosystem in very different ways. So remember that the grass carp is an herbivore, it's eating plants, and we're worried about their effect on wetlands and the species that depend on wetlands for habitat. And they're currently the only species of Asian carp reproducing in the Great Lakes. And then we talked about the black carp, which again are the mussel and snail eaters. We're worried about them potentially extirpating our native mussel populations. But of the 4 Asian carp species, they're the furthest currently from the lakes. And then finally, we talked about the bighead and silver carp, which are the plankton eaters and are on Lake Michigan's doorstep about 47 miles from the lake, but currently not found in the lakes. And so with that, I'd like to thank you guys all for your attention, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
Great, thanks, Peter. Thanks again for everyone joining us. If you have any questions, please do ask them. If you're joining us on Zoom, you can use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to ask those questions. If you're joining us on Facebook Live, feel free to ask your questions right in the comments section of that live stream, and we'll be sure to ask them. So Peter, you answered this question for an audience member before we started, but for those of us, for those of our audience members who weren't there to hear, could you tell us a little bit about eating these fish? Which are edible? Do you have a favorite?
So I've only tried the two fish, the silver and bighead carp, and I thought they tasted pretty good. So historically, they're a delicacy in China where they've been eaten for a while. And there's been efforts in the United States to actually get people to start eating them as a way of maybe controlling their population. But people are a little bit deterred, I think, by the word carp. It kind of conveys like the bottom feeding carp, the common carp, which is a very different kind of fish. It doesn't spend its time up in the water column like these two. And I thought they tasted good. It's a very white, kind of flaky fish, kind of like tilapia. And I think just like tilapia, it's how you prepare it. So, I think it would be a good fish to eat. I do hear that they're kind of hard to clean and very bony. So that is one thing. But I've also heard they've tried to remarket them a while ago by calling them silverfin instead of carp, because they thought that would be maybe more of an attractive term. And that's not uncommon for certain types of fish, like Chilean sea bass. Sea bass is also known as the Patagonian toothfish, which is a much less attractive name than sea bass.
Well, I hope to try one of them at some point. We have another question from Nancy. Do black carp eat invasive mussels too?
That's a really good question. So we do think we're fairly confident that they will eat the invasive mussels. We don't know if they'll eat them enough to control them or really make any kind of important dent in the invasive mussel population we have. And mainly that's because black carp are going to probably, if they were to get in the Great Lakes, stay in the warmer waters, which are kind of in the nearshore areas. And there's mussel populations that are in the cold, deep waters that probably wouldn't be affected. There's also questions about, some of these mussels, the quagga mussels, zebra mussels, can form large clumps together. And that might prevent, if they're clumped together, it might make it hard for black carp to eat them because their mouth can only open so big.
So another question for you, what can we do to help advocate for, what can we do to help prevent Asian carp moving closer to Lake Michigan? Is there legislation that we can advocate for?
Yeah, so there's every so often there's some talk about it in the national media and also a lot in local media about bills that pass that are trying to appropriate funds for certain either types of infrastructure or prevention plans, or maybe listing certain species under acts that would make transporting them illegal. And if that's that's something that you could, if you wanted to, I guess, call your congressman or congresswoman, that'd be one way to engage in that. I think another way is just also if you're a fisherman, or if one concern that you can, one really practical way you can do to help is really to make sure you don't dump your bait. One way that these fish could get in is sometimes in bait stores, it's hard to distinguish a baby Asian carp from normal bait fish. And so every so often you might find a baby Asian carp at a bait store. And if you dump your bait in to let's say Lake Michigan, because you're not catching anything, and you just want to leave, you're essentially releasing an Asian carp into the lake. So never dump your bait. And I think just being generally aware of the situation, that's one way to just be up to date and stay engaged with what's going on with the ecosystem and with Asian carp.
Absolutely. Well, we're out of time. Thank you again, Peter, for enlightening us, telling us all about Asian carp. Thanks again for everyone who's joining us as well. Stay tuned. We have another talk coming from CIGLR at 2:00. So stay tuned.